Good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Eccleston, and I'm Professor of Political Science and Director of the Tasmanian Policy Exchange here at the University of Tasmania. And on behalf of the University, I'd like to welcome you to our first Island of Ideas Public Forum for 2024, Forging a Fire-Ready Future. An incredibly topical issue on a beautiful autumn day here in Hobart, fortunately not too windy. The Island of Ideas series is an incredibly important program which connects the university with the wider community to discuss issues, opportunities and challenges that we collectively face, to share ideas, research and insights, both from the university, the wider community, as well as from well beyond our shores. These conversations are an important part of the university's role: connection, collegiality and community, which date back to our founding in the late 19th century and remain core values and central to the university's mission. As we discuss fire events in our community this evening, we also reflect on the deep history and culture of this island. The University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the Muhunina and the Palawa peoples. They are the original and traditional custodians of the land on which our campuses are built in Lutruwita, Tasmania. We pay respect to elders, past, present and emerging, and those which didn't make elder status. Of particular relevance to this evening's discussion, the Australian Aboriginal people have used landscape and burning for millennia to sustain biodiversity and suppress large bushfires. The Palawa would have gathered here in this area in Nipaluna, Hobart, beneath our mountain, Kunanyi, to share knowledge about skillfully and sustainably managing country with fire. We come together and plan for bushfire as they did, in the hope that we can keep the places and people that we cherish and love safe. As we discuss this topic tonight, we reflect on and acknowledge their deep history of storytelling, knowledge sharing, and particularly their caring for land and country. Fire is obviously a dangerous and traumatic phenomena and event, and the content of tonight's forum may be distressing for some viewers and attendees, especially for those who experience or been affected by bushfires directly or indirectly. Now to the importance of tonight's topic. We all know that climate change is a profound and increasingly urgent ecological challenge with really significant environmental, political, social and economic implications. Put simply, we need to urgently reduce emissions if we're going to avoid catastrophic global warming. But it's more complicated than that, because a lot of damage has already been done. So at the same time, we also need to prepare for and adapt to a rapidly warming climate. We're almost at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline, and increasingly the Paris Accord targets are looking like a pipe dream. So we need to act. I think the good news is that Tasmania is probably better prepared for most when it comes to adapting to a rapidly warming climate. However, we are already experiencing devastating marine heat waves, more extreme weather events, much more variable rainfall, which is impacting our temperate wilderness and our farmers and our communities alike. But perhaps if we ever needed a reminder, the greatest acute climate risk I think we're facing in this community, and indeed for large parts of Australia, is the risk from increasingly frequent and intense fire events. While I'm sure we're more prepared for fire risk than in the past, a key question that we need to ask is this preparation adequate? How will we respond to catastrophic fires, the likes of which we haven't seen since 1967? And more importantly, what can we do as a state, as a community and as individuals to ensure that we are truly fire ready in a warming climate. And that's what tonight's discussion is all about. We're going to begin with our colleague, Professor David Bowman, who's going to set the scene and share the latest scientific insights into fire risks that we're facing in our community. And I'd like to invite David to the stage now. As some of you are aware, many of you are aware, David's an ARC Laureate Fellow and Director of the Transdisciplinary Fire Centre at the University of Tasmania, Professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Science. So please provide a warm welcome for Professor David Bowman.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. And I've got to say, normally I'm fairly cavalier about giving public talks, but I think the situation has changed now and we're suddenly talking about things of very grave consequence. And so to a certain degree, I'm speaking with a heavy heart because we have to now confront some very consequential, serious and vexed problems. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate the magnitude of this problem. It's a global problem. I'm then going to talk about some solutions, framing it within the context of Hobart, which is a really nice model system to think about the global fire crisis and the challenges of adapting to a really new and far more dangerous fire environment. And I'm going to list at the end a whole lot of issues. I'm going to provoke thought. I'm not going to say I have the answers. I have a pathway that I'm following, but I really want the community to engage in a sensible dialogue. But I'm going to provide a warning. I'm going to provide a warning about don't fool yourself about this. And that may be more confronting because everybody wants to fool themselves, including me, about what we're talking about. So fundamentally, there is now, it's kind of official, a global fire crisis. Last week, Texas saw the largest fire in its history. I don't know whether you know, but a nuclear weapons plant was threatened by that fire. Last year, the Californian fire season was off the berserker dial. Something like 3 Tasmanias were burnt in those fires. So we're seeing graph after graph, chart after chart, not a little bit, not a statistical deviation. We're talking about, mind-bogglingly large deviations. In fact, a wildfire journalist, and such people exist now because of the global fire crisis. There was a really interesting piece in the New York Times suggesting that the year 2023 will be the year where we actually stepped out into a far more exposed and dangerous situation. And pretty well every talk I give is always the backdrop in the news of something of unbelievable ferocity or intensity, like the destruction of an entire town in Hawaii last year. One of the things that gives me great confidence to say that I know what I'm talking about is that we're just in the process of finalising a paper where we've looked at the satellite record and we wanted to look at the absolute most extreme fire events on Earth. And these are just the most ridiculously extreme out of tens of millions of observations of fires. And what we have seen in that analysis that we did with Callum Cunningham and Grant Williamson is that in the last 7 years, there have been 6 of the most extreme seasons on record. So we're seeing this amazing surge in super extreme fire events. We can see that in the satellite record now, and that's a record that doesn't lie and can be reviewed objectively. And that work built on some work we did looking at the global exposure of humans to wildfires, and that work has led me, as I'll talk a little bit about, to dealing with global reinsurers. And something I need to reiterate, and I'll come back to, is that, you know, I don't actually care what people think about climate change and whatever. You're about to be hit in the hip pocket by insurance because they know what's going on. They're seeing these records. So back in the Pleistocene, that what I mean by that is before the pandemic, which sounds so far away, there was this thing called the Black Summer bushfires, which we've all forgotten about because of the pandemic, I would suggest. And there was a Royal Commission, and there's a great deal of thought. Now, that's really a shame that we lost the thread off the momentum of the Royal Commission, thinking about the Black Summer fires and all of the reforms that we need to do. And I'm just going to remind you of just how nuts that summer was, because it does seem like a long time ago, but it wasn't. And one of again, one of these bizarre off-the-record things, that there was about a $2 billion health impact of that fire event, and about, statistically, 429 people were killed from the smoke alone. So there was this massive impact from the fires on about half of the Australian population from the smoke. Funny how you can forget that, but those images, which seem to be those strange images of that strange light, were so arresting, and yet it seems to have just sort of dissipated in our memories. One of the things that goes with that smoke is that several calculations, one that I was involved in, showed that the emissions from those fires is about 1.6 times the entire anthropogenic emissions from Australia. So there's this massive impact coming out of these fires on the national carbon budget. But worse is that the entire Earth system was impacted by those fires. Many people don't know this, that because it's still in fragments in the scientific literature. And last year I had the opportunity to review that and to put together a global perspective on those fires, and it was kind of stressful, because you're looking at those fires not as fires anymore, you're looking at them as massive Earth system impacts that were impacting not only biodiversity and humans, but also the Southern Ocean, for goodness sake. There was an anomalous algal bloom with the fallout from the nutrients from the fires, but probably more alarming was the ejection of smoke particles into the stratosphere, which caused regional cooling and possibly exacerbated the strange weather systems that we've had for the last 3 years. The La Nina, it's been hypothesised that was exacerbated, but probably more alarming is that smoke that was injected into the stratosphere has resulted in the discovery of a new form of chemistry that depletes ozone. And that Susan Solomon, who was a scientist, brilliant paper in Nature, describing that as basically all of the work that was done to repair the ozone layer, unless we get a grip on these fires, could unravel that work, and we could be literally very exposed. So these are massive, consequential Earth system impacts. I can't exaggerate this stuff. I can't make this up. This is frightening. Okay, so that's the global scene. What are we going to do about it? What we have to do about it is we've got to start thinking locally. This is the gear change, because, you know, this is bearing down on us, but humans are amazing. Humans are able to copy. Humans are able to replicate. That's what fashion, culture, good ideas, they can spread, if I can excuse the pun, like wildfire, that we can actually motivate ourselves to bring this thing back into line. Because if we don't, we're running the serious risk of drifting off into certainly a brand new sort of environment. It'll be beautiful and wonderful, and there'll be great topography, but it might not be much ice or snow. The problem is it's just not going to be very nice for humans. And we need to start getting a little bit self-interested here, but also taking our responsibility as a custodian of landscapes and a custodian of this beautiful biosphere. So let's think about Hobart. Here we are in Hobart. The gold standard fire disaster in Australian fire management was the 1967 bushfire that very nearly destroyed Hobart. What happened was that there were many fires, but there was one particular fire that was sort of in the bushland in the northern suburbs of Hobart. There was a fire run, and that fire run went from the northern suburbs of Hobart all the way to the coast, running along literally behind the University of Tasmania, and it sped along at an extraordinary speed, wiping out many houses, and it obviously is a concern, as I'll explain, that if we were to have another such run, there is so much more in harm's way because back in the day, 1967, only boomers can remember 1967, that there was a lot less housing stock. Now there's a lot more housing stock, but you can see in this graphic very quickly, in about 2.5 hours, a fire could have, had the wind been slightly different, taken out most of Hobart, frankly. So we had a very, very close shave, and that is a gold standard fire disaster. There have been others, obviously, the 03 fire in Canberra. This century we're seeing more disastrous fires, but certainly this is a very major thing for our city to be thinking about. So what I want to show you is something which I think is absolutely amazing, is that about 2 weeks after the bushfires, there was some aerial photography taken. I'm showing here an image of that aerial photography focused on tethering the perspective to the Cascade Brewery that many of you may know in South Hobart. What I want to do now is I want to zoom in to that site, and you can see the brewery there, and there are several features of this photograph that I want to show. The first feature is, look how open it is around South Hobart, and I will prove just how open it is in a minute. And secondly, look at the canopies of the eucalypts. They're not defoliated, they were severely scorched. But that's telling us it wasn't a fire of maximum ferocity. It was a fire that was a nasty fire, but a lot of it actually was threatening and destroying property, was pretty much a grass fire. Now, one of the beautiful things about this historical photography is that we can now benchmark it to the modern day. And the modern day is, you say, that's not the same image. That's not the same image. No, it isn't the same image, because there's a lot more housing stock. All of those open areas are now covered in eucalyptus. The crowns are very dense. And that, frankly, is a fire disaster waiting to happen. It's a fire disaster waiting to happen. The insurance industry tells me a very interesting fact, that in Hobart there is $9 billion worth of insured liability within 100 metres of bushland. That's an absolutely jaw-dropping amount of risk, and think about how much investment we're making to mitigate that risk. It's not in the scale of millions of dollars, I can assure you of that. So what are we going to do? We need to do integrated fire management. We need to make our landscapes, our urban interfaces different than they are. That's going to require a whole lot of changes, which are going to be very confronting because they are literally on our doorstep. We need green fire breaks. We need to open up vegetation. We need to use herbivores, native and non-native, to reduce fuel loads. We need to thin down forests to reduce the density of fuel, the elevated fuels as we call them, the shrub layers, and in many cases the regrowth that came up after 1967. We need to do prescribed burning in the hinterland, and we need cultural burning. We need a lot of changes. But I know that you were not ready for these changes. I know that. I understand that. Tasmanians have a great habit of objecting to anything. They always like to take sides. But, you know, what I said before is that the insurance industry is actually going to help us with this crisis, because soon you will not be able to have insurance in Hobart because the risk will be too great. So one way out of that is to actually reduce and mitigate the risk, but that's going to require changing our landscapes. But we can do that, I believe, to make biodiverse, beautiful, amenity-rich, sustainable landscapes. But they're going to require change, and it's going to require investment, and it's going to require a social licence. So this is an example from the Hawaiian fire. This house was retrofitted by some owners, and it survived the firestorm all around it. That is not a photoshopped picture. The red house, as it's called, is an example that you can actually massively reduce danger by changing gardens and working on the design and retrofitting houses. It's possible. We can do it. It's possible. But we have to think about how we're going to do it. How do you incentivise that? How do we do this in a society which has got so many other constraints on funding, and so, you know, there's a social justice issue of how do we actually do this? The selfish herd, that's what we're talking about. How, as a community, can we actually get these changes? So what I really want to leave with is some challenges and provocations. Who pays for bushfire management? Well, I know a little bit about this topic because I've been involved in some fascinating discussions with the current government or previous government, whichever government it is, and it turns out paying for bushfire management is a pretty vexed thing, and we're underpowered. We're not investing enough in it. How do we incentivise adaptation? How do we get people to put money into making their house safe? And of course, the selfish herd it makes, if you get enough people making their house safe, their garden safe, their community safe, everybody starts getting a benefit. Dare I say, it's a bit like vaccines, that you get a benefit from that. There will be free riders, there will be people who won't want to change anything. That's okay. But we have to actually think as a selfish herd. How do we strike the balance between firefighting and fuel management? Big things that go boom, 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 boom. Very exciting. But they consume money. A helicopter can spend $1 a second, probably several dollars a second if it's big enough. Now that's exciting, but somebody's paying that dollar. How do we make certain that not all of the dollars go into big things that go boom, 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 and not the little things that we can do around our houses, around our communities? Is it actually a rational strategy to have a policy in the face of catastrophic fire weather for self-organised mass relocations? You might want to call them evacuations, whatever. Is that actually a rational response? Would it not be better if we could create communities that could shelter in place? Would it not be better to have bunkers and safe places for communities to go? One of the things we know from our research is that most people understand what catastrophic fire weather is. They're just not going to act on the advice. We know that. How can we get Indigenous people to be justly involved in fire management? The key word here is justly. How can we find a realistic role for these people who have so much to contribute and have suffered such social disadvantage? This is a challenge, not having a token, but making a real effort to do that. And how can we make fuel management effective, economic, sustainable, biodiverse? That's the vision thing that I've offered. Well, how are we going to do it? Are we going to spend our life disagreeing? And it's kind of hilarious if we spend our life disagreeing. It's a bit like, I said at a conference, it's a bit like, you know, studying the evolution of flammability in a laboratory that's going to be burnt down by fires. You know, that we have to make this shift. We all have to make a shift. Okay, so let's think about some magical thinking. So avoid magical thinking. Everybody wants to have magical thinking, because magical thinking is the security blanket. Forget it. No. We have to confront these challenges. Insurance will not completely assist the recovery. It's not going to happen. There's underinsurance, there's exposure. There might not be insurance. Governments can't be expected to pay for all bushfire adaptation. That's not real. It's not the world we live in. We've got schools and hospitals struggling. The pipe dream that forests can magically, ecologically self-organise to become bushfire-proof, that's a beautiful thought. I love the bush, but that's not real. It's not the reality of all of the danger and the regrowth surrounding us. The idea that Aboriginal people alone can solve the bushfire crisis with no help and no resources. We just believe in it because it's a good thing to believe. And the ultimate form of magical thinking is that climate change is not the driver of the wildfire crisis. Get real, guys, it is. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for setting the scene and outlining a challenge. I didn't take a huge amount of comfort from the fact that we've now got super extreme fire events. The fact that the 1967 fires, notwithstanding the loss of life and property, were probably a moderate fire event, and things could have been much worse. So it's really about understanding the real risk and also challenging our fundamental values and beliefs. And I think that's challenging for our community in terms of coming to a view that we need to manage our bushland, and particularly on the urban fringe, actively and differently. And that is hugely challenging. To unpack these provocations, we've got a fabulous group of panellists who would like to come and join us up on stage. As I said, we'll have a discussion and unpack some of David's provocations, and we'll open it for questions. I think you can see some familiar faces, perhaps starting closest to me. We've got Mike Brown, AM, who was a career firefighter, former chief of the Tasmanian Fire Service, held numerous national roles on various committees and advisory groups, and since he hung up his helmet, if that's the right turn of phrase, continues to be very active, and particularly in the Emergency Leaders for Climate Change group. Lord Mayor, Councillor Anna Reynolds, thank you for joining us for tonight's forum. Beyond her leadership and civic roles, Anna, of course, has made a massive contribution in terms of advocating for more ambitious climate action right throughout her career in a range of jurisdictions, and has certainly continued that work in local government and as Mayor, Lord Mayor of the City of Hobart. Thank you, Anna. Dr. Philippa McCormick is one of Tasmania's leading exports. Philippa is a relatively recent doctoral graduate in environmental and climate law from the University of Tasmania, and now is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Adelaide, specialising in climate adaptation law. But Philippa remains deeply connected to Tasmania, and it's fantastic to have you here this evening, Philippa. Thank you. Professor Greg Lehman, Professorial Fellow in Indigenous Research and former Pro-Vice Chancellor of Indigenous Leadership here at the University of Tasmania. Thank you, Greg. There's I think one central theme or provocation that David posed was this idea, I think it's true of governments the world over. We tend to focus on the acute problems, the squeaky wheel in politics, rather than investing in prevention, in this case, landscape management to prevent fire risks. Interested in views across the panel, do you feel that that's the case here in Australia and Tasmania at this point of time? And what can we do to try to get that balance right in terms of managing fires on the day, firefighting, yet trying to prevent and reduce fire risk?
Thanks for that, Richard. Look, it's fair to say that on the whole emergency management wheel, where we've got prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, I think fire services have been more focused on the response part of that wheel than the other areas over time. But I think things have turned around somewhat. Probably a big step, I know from my career, and this really happened right across the country, is that a lot of lessons were learnt out of another fire emergency. That was the 2009 Black Saturday experience. There was a Royal Commission into that incident, 173 reasons, 173 people died in the space of one afternoon for taking the outcomes of that very, very seriously. And we knew from that point, right across the country really, that we needed to focus more on fuel management measures. So with that, we had some mechanisms within our Act and within TFS, and we were able to step those up and lobbied fairly hard with government to get things better funded. So about that time, in fact, government changed. This is about a decade ago, and government came in with a commitment to spend $28.5 million, which is pretty big in Tasmanian figures, on a fuel reduction program over 4 years. And that enabled the State Fire Management to get some teeth, State Fire Management Council that is, to get some teeth and to be able to do some detailed research and analysis on how we were going to get best bang for buck in terms of fuel management and fuel reduction across the state. And a lot of work was done in that. In fact, a whole lot of computer modelling was done. Millions of fires were lit in a computer room, not out in the field, to look at the analysis of how those fires would respond and how those fires would respond if we were able to, in fact, cut the fuels by half or at least some percentage. And it has been a good exercise in risk reduction. There's been hundreds, if not thousands, of fuel reduction burns and other mitigation activities done across the state over recent years, and I think it's had a real effect. But I think we've got to understand that that is about risk reduction. It is certainly nowhere near risk elimination. So steps have been taken, and that's been a little bit of a change from really all the money going into the response phase.
Thanks, Mike. So we're heading in the right direction, but whether it's enough remains an open question. Anna, I guess both in terms of that broad trade-off, but also the issue around funding, and also we've got all three levels of government that have got a role to play here. I mean, from your perspective, is it as joined up and coordinated as it needs to be?
Well, just on the work that the City of Hobart has done for a number of years on our bushfire management, and we do have a team, some of them who are here tonight, our fire and biodiversity team, and so the city's taken this issue very seriously for more than a decade, both because we recognise that we manage, half of the land we manage is bushland, and so we need to look after it from a perspective of biodiversity, and obviously our bushland needs fire, but also because it's very clear that we're one of the most bushfire prone places in Australia and maybe even the world, I think David says. So we do need to take it seriously. So we've got about 14, 15 staff who work in that unit, spend more than $3 million a year on providing green fuel breaks, so about 50 hectares of fuel breaks around the city, but that's between our bushland and people's houses, and ensuring that the fire trails around the foothills of the mountains are smooth enough for fire trucks to drive on, and we also do fuel reduction burns, and we've a patchwork of those that we do think about the biodiversity impact. So they're certainly taking it seriously, but we could spend 10, 20, 50 times more money. For example, the mechanical thinning part of the equation is expensive, and we did do a bit of mechanical thinning on some key escape routes. So some of our suburbs have only one road in and one road out, and so we were able to secure some money to look at trees that were particularly at risk if they fell. If there was a fire through and they fell, they'd block the road. And so we did that work, I think it was around Ridgeway, but we're actually now putting in money to the federal government for a grant program to try and do that in other parts of Hobart. And if we don't get that money, we just simply don't have the money to do that work. So who does that work? Who pays? And obviously that work is really essential. As David's saying, we need to move on it quickly. So we are dependent on federal government money. The new government is spending more and seems to be pushing grants out the door to very innovative new community responses. And I think the idea that the community will have to self-organise and take more steps to assess their own risk is a really important theme that's coming out all around the country. And there are now new players, new institutions that are actually providing that information and intelligence directly to community members, because some of the older institutions, our emergency management agencies, they're fabulous at doing the work they do in terms of responding to an event, but they're not necessarily the best institutions to plan the preventative measures, to plan the adaptation. Increasingly, we're going to need new approaches, new institutions and new tools.
Before we move on, Philippa, you've studied a lot of the legislation and the legislative responsibilities and obligations of government. And do you think the system is fit for purpose and sufficiently joined up?
No. A little while ago, I led a project that included David and some other colleagues that mapped out the anatomy of bushfire law, the laws that exist in Australia to help us prepare, to respond and to recover from fires. And in the end, we kind of got to a point where it was like, well, all the law, really, because building laws really matter and land use planning laws really matter. But so does air pollution controls and how we plan transport infrastructure and our conservation laws and native vegetation management, let alone our cultural heritage and our emergency response laws. They are all relevant, and they are not built to talk to each other. And perhaps in the past that was okay. That's arguable. It is certainly not okay for the future that we face. And we have had opportunities. So over the past 7 years or so, the government's been in a process of reviewing our Fire Service Act, 1979 legislation, so it's quite old. We have learned some things since 1979, and David has shared some of those with us. A draft bill has been released, and I was really excited about the opportunity to feed into the process of creating a really great framework for building connections between how farmers plant and manage windbreaks, and how we manage air pollution and smoke in the atmosphere, and how we manage native vegetation and conservation, and the Tasmanian Aboriginal people taking up some responsibility and some opportunities and some joy and some cultural freedom as an expression of reconciliation to bring people into the conversation so we might all take a role. And I was a little bit disappointed. Perhaps my expectations were a touch too high, but I was surprised to see in the new legislation that precise question about how we connect everything up was missing. And some of the things that the old legislation actually does try to do were missing. And I feel like that draft, that first try, didn't tackle at all the urgency of that shift from response to really effective, connected preparation. And I had really wanted to see what it looked like to do that well, that shift well, to build obligations, incentives, opportunities, power, institutions that said, let's do this together in real life. And there's still time.
There's time, but the clock's ticking. Greg, in terms of this holistic response, what can we learn in terms of Aboriginal knowledge when it comes to land and fire management, and how can we perhaps better capture that knowledge in terms of the overall response?
The first thing that we can learn is what not to do, a lot of things not to do. Firstly, I'd just like to thank you for acknowledging the Moinina people, who were the First Nations who called this place home, this part of the Western Shore. They didn't suffer from a problem that was highlighted very early on in David's talk when, what words did you use? Coexistence with fire. Now, that coexistence with fire is even a thing, is even a problem, points right to the heart of what we're grappling with. And, we're grappling with colonisation. Not all, but many of the places in the world that have really suffered from major fire catastrophes, including Hawaii, have displaced traditional owners with knowledge about not just managing fire and burning, but most importantly, living with fire, having fire as part of country, part of your understanding of country, part of what the experience that you call home. We've lost that, and it was an active process. It was a very foolish process. In Arnhem Land, I don't think it was through an act of generosity, but a lot of that practice and knowledge and ceremony and the balance of the business of coexistence is still in place. Here it hasn't been. So the first thing that we really have to do is to grow up, to mature as a nation and start treating this place like it really is home, rather than just trying to ignore things in the hope that they won't happen or they'll go away, because we're learning rapidly that that doesn't work. That's, as you say, that's magical thinking, David. The other thing I want to say is that, and again, little bits of wisdom on the screen earlier on, from little things, big things grow. Back around 2000, I was working in the Parks and Wildlife Service, and I came across a wonderful person, and his name was Tony Blanks, and he was the manager of the fire section. And why was he so wonderful? Apart from the fact that he had a lot of experience with fire, including some fires that got away famously, but also a lot of experience in fire suppression. But the most wonderful thing about him was that he knew how to listen, and he knew what he didn't know. That probably logically doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean. And he said to me, your community know about fire, live with fire for 2,000 generations. What can we do? And over a number of conversations, we thought it would be a good idea to, for the very first time, this is 2000, to create a program to provide training to create an Aboriginal fire crew. Now, I'm not a firefighter. I did a fire suppression certificate, but it's way out of date now. But that triggered off a process which has continued to build and grow to the point where today, rather than just a couple of successes coming out of that Aboriginal fire crew training program, I'll mention them actually because they were outstanding. Shane Mundy and oh God, the other person's name's gone out of my head. I'll think of him in a minute. We've now got to a point where we've started to build up land and sea rangers, fire and land management crews. One of the people who's really energised and seen that thing through is Andrew Sculthorpe from the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre. So we started off very, very small. Lani Everett. We started off with a couple of people, and I don't know what the count is now of community who are out there burning and learning and re-enlivening culture and connection to country. But, you know, that's a move in the right direction. But as David said, and maybe we can come back to this, just making Aboriginal people responsible isn't the solution, because 200 years of disempowerment and separation. Don't forget that the government here went out of their way to exile every Aboriginal person they could find to Flinders Island. You know, there was a process of ethnic cleansing on this island, and that we're living with the consequences of that action. So we've got to take some time to start to rebuild that cultural capital.
Thanks, Greg. I think for most of us, the aerial photos of South Hobart, West Hobart and Knocklofty were pretty confronting. I, for one, me and my family live just on the edge of one of those aerial photos. We know that the state is very fire prone. The topography suits fire. We've got increasing fuel loads, increasing infrastructure and people in the way of fire in a warming climate. Just get the panel's view on sort of David's provocation that we need to actively manage landscape, and I think particularly that kind of peri-urban fringe, actively and quite differently. You know, what that might look like. Perhaps Mike, I mean, if money wasn't an object, what would be your advice? And there was a huge consensus that this need to happen. And we didn't have a vibrant civil society. And we laugh about it. I mean, we love this place and love the landscape, and it's really, really challenging. You know, how can we live with it when it's so threatening? Anyway, I'm rambling, but what would you do, Mike?
Putting fire into the landscape is actually a natural thing. So to be burning dry sclerophyll forests in Tasmania is actually a natural thing, because many of our species are fire adapted and many others are also fire dependent. So it's a responsible thing, in fact, to add fire in a timely way, and the fire regime needs to be right. Otherwise you'll undo things and you'll start developing farms of very fire dependent vegetation. So that's got to be carefully managed, and the science has got to be applied to it. But it's not a one size fits all. And if we look at the landscape right across Tasmania, the original reports that State Fire Management Council did ahead of the fuel reduction program was that there's only 42% of the land that's treatable with fire. So in those other places, perhaps they're less populated and we live with it. We certainly can't go adding fire to rainforests, to alpine forests, to farmland. So it only leaves a proportion of forests you can actually, and grassland you can actually apply fire to. But it's not a one size fits all package. There is definitely a place for mechanical fuel reduction and maintaining green breaks around residential and built up areas. And I had a boss many years ago by the name of Neil Manning in the Southeast District who swore and declared that having goats in a controlled way in some areas would pay dividends in terms of managing fuel as well. So there's a whole lot of ways to reduce that fuel, and that's only in fuel management. There's got to be a lot of ways too in which we can better inform and empower and educate communities. So there's been some good things done over the last decade in particular in that regard, but still we're knowing that people aren't necessarily acting in the way that we want them to act, in the time that we really do want them to act and listen.
Did you want to come in there, Philippa? Because one of the manifestations of this tension between conserving the environment and managing fire risks, is in the law. We've got planning laws, we've got environmental protection laws, yet we've also got an imperative to do more in terms of managing landscape.
Yes, I could speak for so long about that, and I mustn't. I think probably the thing that I would highlight is that one of the challenges we face is that our land use planning laws allow us to guide and govern new developments. So we can put in place rules about minimum standards for protection of new housing stock, for example. Whether we do, and in the way that we ought, is a different question, but we could. And so there have been improvements in the way that planning laws set standards and expect improvements in our housing stock. But what we're left with is a very, very large number of houses and sheds and fences that were not governed by those standards. And our planning laws don't say, if you have a house, you must maintain it to this standard and we're going to enforce that. The retrofitting task is not easily governed in the laws that we have at the moment. And so often the question comes back then to incentives. How do we incentivise people to step out of their 18-hour, a day job with their children or their elderly parents, their dog who is unwell, their life going on all around them, and then invest the time and energy? And it is, in some cases, an extraordinary amount of time and energy, mental load and work and money to maintain a house that is close to the bush, where the bush may or may not be on their land. Sometimes it isn't. And so that's a community question and an individual question, a capacity building question. And we see throughout our emergency laws, through the strategies and planning from the international level down, this concept of shared responsibility. And it's ubiquitous and it's opaque. It's not at all clear precisely what we are demanding of individual landholders and of communities in terms of asking them to prepare themselves and be ready. And David said in his presentation, it absolutely matters that people choose to do that because we can protect each other by taking those actions. But from a legal perspective, I don't think we've nailed that yet, and there's a lot of work to do. I mean, I was reminded while David was speaking about the just extraordinary success of rooftop solar, despite a decade of, insane conversation about climate change. People saw a benefit, an opportunity to earn money, feeding energy back into the grid in areas like Adelaide, where I visit regularly, and those incentives worked despite the politics of everything else. And if we could find something like that for fire hardening of homes, for garden management, wouldn't that be extraordinary? I mean, if we were able to build some kind of expectation that not only would land use planning be being updated and, trying novel things, but we would build some kind of workforce around the existing housing stock to improve it.
Thanks, Philippa. Anna?
I was just going to mention one of these bright spots on the landscape around some of the new innovative institutions that are setting up to tackle some of these sort of issues. So there's an organisation called the Resilient Building Council. It's quite new. It's only 2 or 3 years old. Very motivated small NGO. They've created a new app where you can put your address in and it will give you an assessment of the risk of your home to particularly bushfire risk. But not only that, it gives you a list of things to do. And as you tick off that list, slowly your rating improves in terms of how resilient your home is to bushfire. So it's a very practical project. They're now moving to the next level and trying to actually develop an army of assessors who you will be able to ring and say, can you come and do this with me? And then maybe the next step will be those assessors will be able to organise the various tradies to come and do bits and pieces of that work. But the other part is they are working now with the insurance industry to try and get incentives in. So if you do, move further down the risk rating, you will get a benefit in terms of insurance premium reduction. So, it's really through the motivation of a small group of people that's even happening. Now, motivated governments could turbocharge that by giving them more money or requiring local governments to sort of engage with all of their residents through rates notices and say, you've got to do this. So there's ways you could turbocharge it, but there are certainly innovations happening in response to the challenge.
Thank you. The other issue that was touched on in the presentation is around when we do have a truly catastrophic fire event. It's going to be an exercise in survival. And this question about whether we've done enough work around what a mass evacuation might look like. We get good and better information from the fire service and through the ABC and media with localised updates. But if there is a fire that within a few hours could threaten tens of thousands of residents of Hobart or other fire-prone cities, are we really set up to do that? And I'm not sure, Anna or Mike?
I'll start off on that one. So the whole language about relocating or evacuation really needs to be carefully considered. And I haven't gone to the dictionary, I've just got my definition. So if we're talking about evacuation, that might be something that's ordered by an authority somewhere. It's must be immediate and it's en masse. Whereas relocating might be something that's more planned, may not be so immediate, but it's still something that's going to be taking place. And with the language that we used in my day, I'm not so sure how it is now, was pretty much always relocate. So we're asking people ahead of the fire or ahead of the catastrophic fire danger rating weather to relocate if they're in a bushfire prone area. So to get out of it, go to family or the city or the beach in another location. So those extreme or catastrophic fire weather conditions don't last generally for terribly long. So you might relocate early in the morning or possibly even the night before if you're in a bushfire prone area to get out of it. If you've gone and left it too late, you'll often see the message, and I heard it the other day when I was in Melbourne. They had 40 degree weather and there's some bad fires around the Grampians and Ballarat. And they said, if you've not left now, you've left it too late, shelter in place, which means stay in your home, and there's some other instructions given about what you should be considering as you shelter in place. So close the house up, make sure everything's ember-proof, get rid of the coir mat off the front deck, and et cetera, et cetera. So evacuation's one that, look, it's applicable in some other emergency management considerations. It's less applicable, and I don't think it's the right language when we're talking about the threat of bushfire under extreme or catastrophic fire weather conditions.
Thanks, Mike. Anna?
Yeah, this is a little bit of a project that I've had for a couple of years now since having a good chat with David. David is always an inspiration for thinking about things that we need to do differently and better. So I started asking the question, well, where can I get the evacuation plan for the Western Shore of Hobart, for my city that I'm, responsible for? And it doesn't exist. There is no evacuation plan. So I did start asking questions about who's responsible. I started talking to people from some of the agencies that have again come up since the Royal Commission, because the Royal Commission recommendations that David mentioned do have a whole chapter on evacuation planning, because there were lessons to be learned about how to plan, how to get communities ready, how to ensure all the agencies are organised. So there's a whole chapter with about 4 key recommendations. So I asked the Premier at the time, who's organising implementation of the Royal Commission recommendations regarding evacuation planning in Tasmania. And he said, well, that'll be my department. But then I spoke to his department and they said, no, that's the police department. Then we did have a person at the council who was very well connected with emergency services and did organise an exercise to try and start thinking about evacuation of a large number of Western Shore suburbs, but that wasn't sort of particularly organised. It was a bit of a one-off event, and I still haven't got to the bottom of it. I've now had a response from the police department saying, well, actually, it's sort of going to be our responsibility, but we are going to try and get the regional fire management committees to do a bit more work with people. But again, we've just got to up our game. We've got to be a lot more organised. We've got to sort out these implementation failures, sort out who's going to be responsible, and not be fearful of evacuation planning. So a lot of emergency management agencies say, look, we don't want to plan a scenario because it might not be the scenario that actually happens, and then people will have planned a particular scenario. But we don't have that approach with evacuation planning for buildings. There are signs up everywhere. We know what to do. If we worked in this place, we would have every month or so there'd be an exercise. So even though the threat in a building could be a fire in this location or it could be a fire in that location, but we've still got some systems that we know, we tell everybody who comes to the place, and we rehearse and practice. And ultimately, even though the scale is so much bigger, we have to do the same sort of thing with evacuation planning for bushfire-prone cities, in my opinion.
Thanks, Anna. And a lot of the comments online, and I suspect in the audience, are what are the practical things as individuals and communities we can do? And I think there's a big opportunity there. I mean, one thing that I think worries all of us is the growing number of Tasmanians and older Tasmanians who live alone. Many of them don't have access to transport. What's their capacity to evacuate? And maybe it's about a grassroots kind of community network. Who are the vulnerable people in your community, the neighbourhoods who might need help and advice? One online question is around a contradiction, and an anonymous viewer is asking the question, if global warming and fires are driving emissions and we've got this kind of self-reinforcing cycle, is it really such a good idea to be regularly using fire as part of the management strategy? And how can that be sustainable? I think there is an answer there, but David, I might hand that one to you.
So the question concerns the side effects of fuel management and exacerbating climate change. So these trade-offs are extremely complicated, and we see these trade-offs also with exposure to humans to smoke, and smoke particles and greenhouse gases scale. And what we do know is that if you have uncontrolled fires, you get extraordinary air pollution and you expose huge populations. If you use fuel management strategically, you can prepare these environments and you will have lower fire severity. But the side effect is that under certain conditions, and the conditions favourable for fuel management, you'll end up polluting airsheds. Sydney Basin is a classic example, or you locally pollute the suburb that you're protecting. So these are the adverse side effects, which are really complicated trade-offs, and we're still researching these questions. But that's why the opportunities to immediately transform landscapes using tools other than fire are so attractive, because once you get them into a fit state, dare I say, possibly something like was under Indigenous management, by reducing tree densities, you can then use fire in a lot more sympathetically and less combustion. But then the question is, well, what do you do with the biomass that you're removing? And the answer to that, I would suggest, and you could have a virtuous cycle where we could be improving, say, the surrounds of Hobart, and at the depot where people take green waste, that green waste could be turned into useful products. And one of the useful products could be bioenergy pellets, where you could use, at least be using that biomass to offset other uses of energy. So there are all sorts of interesting trade-offs. But the fact is, it's sort of magical thinking, again, if you think, well, because doing fuel management is going to have some effect by releasing greenhouse gases, we'll just not do anything. And that will be great because the trees will sequester all of this carbon. And the magical thinking component of that's not considering that the climate's getting drier and lightning is increasing, and those, before you know it, all of the gains you had by not burning it literally go up in smoke, and you get catastrophic greenhouse gas pollution. So we're looking at some very, very complicated trade-offs here, and biochar might also be part of the story as well. But I would like to think that we are clever enough to get maximum benefit by removing the biomass and changing the fuel structures to make the sorts of subsequent fuel management not particularly polluting. At the moment, if you burn many of these landscapes, they're enormously polluting because there's so much biomass has accumulated, and the fires are very difficult to control, and they often overachieve in area and also in the severity and the impact of the fires.
Thank you. My question is, there's been a large number of burn-offs around Hobart, and I've raised a particular one up the back of the university here with David previously. Quite a number of them seem to have burnt very hot and have killed a lot of the vegetation up from 3 to 10 metres, which is now dead. A huge number of trees now dead across those vegetations. My question is, have we actually made it worse when those trees fall to the ground, increasing the wood mass and the biocombustibility of those places? And is what we're doing actually fit for purpose or making it worse?
Well, thank you for so eloquently framing a research project we're developing. And literally, one of the most exciting things that's happened is that the University of Tasmania has about 67 hectares of bushland that is being burnt in fuel management, is polluting, does have an environmental impact, but is trying to reduce a hazard. And one of the exciting things is that the university's given my group permission to trial some alternatives in fuel management, to do something different. And moreover, and I think this is the critical thing, to actually showcase this and to consider the biodiversity effects and to take the community along on a journey where we can not do the shock and awe of suddenly the authorities have decided they're going to do this at scale, but to demonstrate what we could do and understand using scientific methods the positive and negative benefits of those interventions in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, amenity. So we are hoping to get some additional funding to do the demonstration side of things, but we're definitely going to do, and we are doing this research. And I think without that research, but most critically, the thing we need is to reassure the community that this isn't just talk or it's something that's going to be done by stealth. We need to be completely transparent about the pros and cons, show people what are the options on the table and what the risk benefits are. And I am 100% certain that such demonstration sites will take the temperature down and will not only reassure people and possibly we will be able to incentivise these treatments, but it will be from little things, big things grow, that we will be able to, that demonstration site will then be able to be replicated in new environments, new communities, not only in Tasmania, but across Australia. And indeed, my vision is to make a consortium of such demonstration sites around the world, because that's how we're going to stem the global fire crisis, is by actually getting local communities to do things at scale and not just to think that there is only one sort of medicine or only one sort of tool in the toolbox. There are lots. Let's find out the best ones fit for purpose.
Thanks, David. And Mike, quickly had a comment?
Yeah, look, fuel reduction burning is a risky process wherever it's done. There's been classic cases throughout the world really, of where fuel reduction burns have got away and done untold damage and even impacted on communities. So it's a tough job, takes up a lot of resources, and to do it right takes a lot of work. But sometimes when you do the burn in a cooler time of the year and there is a lot of fuel underneath, so it does crown up through the trees a bit, and the trees may die or at least appear to be dead, that's part and parcel of what can happen sometimes during fuel reduction. You've got to ask, is the damage that was done, say, 2 months ago when it was significantly cooler and wetter, how would the damage have been if it's this Saturday when it's 35 degrees and blowing hard? So there's always a risk with it, and you're damned if you do and damned if you don't.
In my mid-80s, I'm one of the declining number of people who were actually fighting the 1967 bushfires around the Boyer paper mill. While there was significant peripheral damage, the mill was saved by the infrastructure of sprinkler systems and hydrant systems. Moving to more recent times, I attended a seminar in late 2019, Feeling the Heat, Bushfires and Hobart's Insurance Risk. And I think some of the speakers tonight were there then. That prompted me to look at fire hydrants in suburban Hobart. When we had moved to our home in Sandy Bay, the nearest hydrant was blocked from access by a chest-high rosebush. And I dealt with that, but I also took up the issue with Taswater after Tas Fire Service told me it was not Tas Fire Service's responsibility, but Tas Water. And I surveyed about 100 fire hydrants around Churchill Avenue and Sandown area. About 20% of them were obstructed by either vegetation or the hydrants in the road, the fine metal, when some road resealing had been done. Tas Water remedied that. Tas Water organised, after my prompting, what has become statewide fire hydrant testing program. You can look for that online.
Thank you.
And it covers 6 months of last year. I've asked Tas Water for advice on extensions from there, but it also depends on us, the community, because many of these obstructed hydrants are in your nature strip.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So we need better infrastructure and investment in that infrastructure. It actually comes back to a theme of the discussion and an online question as well, if we can link them together, and that is a just and equitable transition. And someone online has made the point that we're all aware of. We're in a housing crisis and a housing affordability crisis. Can we afford to be, and should we be prioritising improving the quality and fire safety of existing properties when we've also got this huge need for new dwellings and affordable dwellings? Another question there is, what can tenants do? 40% of our population, nearly all of our students, a lot of our students are renting. They're aware of the risks, but with limited means and not even ownership over the property, are there any options there?
So if you consider what happened in Lismore, a town that got struck by 2 diabolical floods, there was already obviously demographic changes in that region, but suddenly you've got no housing stock. You have nobody who can even go there to build and repair the houses. So the people who are going to do the interventions had nowhere to live either. So sure, there's a housing crisis, but not really. The housing crisis we should be reflecting on is what happens when there's 1,000, 2,000 fewer houses than there were yesterday. And that's the reality that we need to be thinking about, that we could lose in a day a suburb or 2.
I think the other reality that governments ignore is that climate change and adapting to climate change is going to be expensive. There's no way of sugarcoating it, and it is going to require significant investment. And the challenge is that those who are most able to contribute to that cost do so. And that's a kind of, I guess, broader kind of tax challenge. You've got a question up here. Oh, thank you.
This is a question for David. Yep. Can you reflect on the risk that fuel reduction, which is talked about a lot recently, could be seen as a magic bullet for preventing fire impact during catastrophic fires?
So these are very complex questions, and when you think about what is a catastrophic fire day, what are the likely consequences of that? And what I would like to switch it around is the thought experiment, that's what I was trying to confront you with, is imagine if there was severe, horrifyingly severe, say, weather forecast in Hobart, say 45 degrees and a very, very strong wind. And imagine if everybody goes, so what? It doesn't matter, because we've, as Greg has been saying, we are so attuned now to our environment and we're living in such a way that it just doesn't matter. You see, the problem is at the moment, why the reason for the evacuation or the mass relocation, is it matters a lot. Because what is it effectively that doctrine is saying? It's an avowed form of fatalism. We're so off base that if people, and we know many will, the vast majority actually, stay in place, they are going to be so overwhelmed by something. Unfortunately, I have to say this, but many people are going to die. And that's what I know. And it doesn't make me happy. So imagine if we could get into a situation, because we've got retrofitted houses, sensible gardens, sensible strategies to manage the risk. It's just like water's off a duck back. That's what it will mean to be a Tasmanian in the Anthropocene, an Australian to be in the Anthropocene, but we're not there yet. And so the reason, the fixation on this, is that we're needing urgent interim measures to save lives at the cost of property. We know the properties will be destroyed. We know that. We understand that, right? Now, that's obviously a metastable or a very unstable arrangement. The insurance industry isn't very happy about that. We can do better, but we can only do better if we have sensible, self-correcting, fire-safe landscapes and communities that go hand in hand, and we're not anywhere near that at the moment. So all of we're doing are literally emergency responses of trying to dial down the scale of the catastrophe, because the catastrophe is going to be literally catastrophic. That's why it's called catastrophic fire weather. This is no joking matter. We know what happened in Dunalley. But that's what I'm urging, and will require dramatic changes to landscape, lifestyles, structures, and fundamentally cultures.
If I can just add to that one too, because it's a good point. So fuel reduction burning, we've seen it time and time again pull up major fires. So if we've seen a fire on a typical summer's day run into an area that's been fuel reduced, say in the last 2 or 3 years, it has a dramatic impact on pulling up the fire and makes it more controllable. If we're talking about catastrophic fire danger rating weather, which was only invented after Black Saturday experience, the people realised we needed another fire danger rating on top of the extreme, it's a different ballgame. So you've got burning embers blowing 10, 20 kilometres ahead of the major fire. So fuel reduction or fuel reduced areas don't make a whole lot of difference. Big aircraft, and lots of them, don't make a lot of difference. So it's a completely different ballgame. The fire will run where it's going to run, no matter what treatment's been done, unless you concreted the whole landscape. It'll still run.
One final question from online, because we're almost out of time, and I'm sorry we're not going to get to a lot of questions. But we're talking about green buffers and green zones. And I think a question for Greg, but we might have to take it on notice. Can we think about the mix of plants and draw on 40,000+ years of Aboriginal knowledge in terms of knowing which plants are more flammable, perhaps to help with creating a green buffer, as well as strategies like control burning and cultural burning?
I think there's a level of accumulated wisdom across First Nations in Australia, which is complex, and people are probably sick of hearing that these are complex problems, but they require complex responses. So no matter where you go in Australia, there isn't one way of cultural burning. There's multiple ways of cultural burning across various temperate zones and across various types of vegetation. It's incredibly complex, and generation upon generation embeds that kind of knowledge in ceremony, in cultural practice, in traditional law. I think all I can really say is, we are facing the consequences as a modern society in Australia today of trying to bracket ourselves off from all of that complexity and thinking that it'll be okay. And catastrophic fires are only things that we see on television. You know, anybody here who's done some Australian ecology knows that eucalypt forests want to burn. They need to burn in many ways. So I think we've got to learn to go back to that point. We've got to learn to coexist with fire. In Tasmania, there's a big difference between the frequency of fire on the west coast and frequency of fire on the east coast. It's got a lot to do with rainfall. It's got a lot to do with the adaptation of forest and vegetation types to those different average rainfalls. Aboriginal people in Tasmania didn't invest large amounts of labour in building permanent structures on the east coast. One of the reasons for that was that it burned too often. It's just not the case that there were no runaway fires during Aboriginal custodianship of country. There were big fires. There have been big fires throughout the 60,000 years of human occupation of Australia. People did invest effort in building permanent structures and villages of a dozen or more houses on the west coast because it made sense to do so. So there's a simple bit of wisdom in that. You have to be crazy to want to build a house on Bonnet Hill, especially one made out of wood. That's just insane. That's nowhere near the idea of coexistence or recognising and understanding or accepting the nature of the country that you want to call home.
Thanks, Greg. We need to start wrapping up, but a quick question here.
Thank you very much. I don't know the question, it's more of acknowledgement what we talked about. David, I've known you for 7 years now. We burnt on Von Bibber's property up the Central Highlands. Your speech at the start was probably one of the most inspirational, serious speeches around fire that I've ever heard, and I really hope people really hit that hard on their chest to realise where we're actually sitting right now. Anna, I've had conversations up on the council land with the Hobart City Council. The work that some of these people are doing up there is nothing short of sensational. The way that cultural burning is starting to come into it is fantastic. Okay, my name's Jason Andrew Smith. I run a little thing called Patrol and Diary, Fire Good. So for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been around the Huon Valley teaching people how to reconnect back with country, getting back out on country and not being scared of fire. In all fairness, I've been winging this. I've been doing GoFundMes, TFS, Mike. Last year, you guys got me to go out and do some junior programs out at Campania. The feedback from them was absolutely inspirational. But in all fairness, I'm sick of these boxes getting ticked. I'm sick of organisations, even Aboriginal organisations, getting all the money when it comes to this. We need grassroots people and people like me to actually start getting support so I can get out and continue to teach what I'm trying to teach, okay? I thank you very much for what you're doing here, but we've got to stop talking. This isn't a game anymore. It's got to stop, all right?
Thanks, Jason. Really
Thank you.
Good point. And an example of positive action coming from the community. We are running short of time, but I'd like to quickly go across the panel in terms of taking a positive message away. What is the 1 or 2 things that we can do from your perspective to reduce our risk and the risk posed by fire in our community?
So Philippa mentioned the term shared responsibility, and in fire protection, bushfire protection is a shared responsibility. The fuel over your back fence matters. What matters greatly is the fuel at your back doorstep, and that's something you can do something about.
Anna?
I'd say do the bushfire resilience app in the next couple of months and work out what your list of things to do is. Start thinking about some sort of getting involved if there is a community group, a neighbourhood community group. Start thinking about some more awareness around fire risk and some events. I know in South Hobart they had a kind of a fun evacuation. It wasn't particularly well attended, but they had a barbecue at the end of it, and everyone sort of, it was just a community building exercise. And I guess, support campaigns to dramatically reduce greenhouse emissions and reduce fossil fuels, because ultimately we have to switch off that tap that's really fueling this fire at some point, and that has to happen now. So get behind any campaigns that are talking about fossil fuel phase-outs.
David?
I'd like everybody to come on the journey, and the journey is that we're going to achieve sustainable relationship with landscape fire, and it's going to be transformative, and it's going to be rewarding, and it's going to really have huge economic benefits and reduce a huge amount of psychosocial stress, and that we need all of the possible channels and pathways and support through schools and through local council and state and federal government to actually make communities feel that they can make a difference and reduce their exposure and make the world a better and safer place.
Philippa?
I want to talk about bunkers, but it's not the right time. If you're interested, come and talk to me later. My key messages are, I think you need to get to know your neighbours, find out their phone number and contact them. Practice your plan, don't just write it down, actually do it. It took me ages longer than I wanted it to the first time I did it. I'm getting better and better. Don't just get to know your neighbours, get to know your place. I think that's a really beautiful invitation to get to know the place around you and care for it really deeply, and take every single election as an opportunity to make it clear that you want to be safe, that you want to belong, and that you want to love the place you end up in 40, 50 years' time from now.
You should have had the last word, I think. I think we need to get out of reaction. We need to get out of this habit of just jumping into reactive crisis mode and be proactive. Let's stop planning to spend $1 a second on helicopters, and I don't even know how much money per second it takes to fly that 737 water bomber that I saw flying over my house a few years ago. Put that money into investing in the sort of thing that Jason's talking about, supporting local communities, regional communities, or government agencies to work together so that we can reduce the risk. We can't disappear the risk, but we can certainly be proactive and reduce it. And Aboriginal burning is a part of that process, an important part.
Brilliant. Thank you, Greg. So to conclude, please join me in particularly thanking David Bowman for his presentation. Also a wonderful panel, Greg, Philippa, Anna and Mike. Thank you. I'd like to thank the events team for their support in terms of putting this together, but most importantly, I'm thanking you for coming along tonight and contributing to this forum, and also to the 200 or so people that we've had listening online. Again, a big issue, and I apologise we didn't get to all of the questions, but a lot of these issues don't lend themselves to relatively simple and straightforward answers. But the first step towards addressing any challenge is awareness, and I think, if nothing else, these types of forums are a really important part of that in terms of how we can prepare for the growing risk associated with fire. Thank you.